Alright, today we're going to be answering some questions about these box and whisker plots that we created on page 8 yesterday. Shh, be quiet. So, before we move on, I want to rewrite the 5-number summary so that when we're answering the questions, we have that information. So, for the 70s, what was the minimum? What was the maximum? What was quartile 1? 25. Quartile 2? And quartile 3. Okay, for the 80s, what was the minimum? Maximum? Quartile 1? What? 33. Quartile 2? And quartile 3. Okay, for the 90s, what was the minimum value? What? 27? The maximum? Quartile 1? Quartile 2? And quartile 3? Okay, and then for the 2000s, what was the minimum? Maximum? Quartile 1? Quartile 2? And quartile 3? What? Okay, so for those of you who were not here yesterday, we did the 5-number summaries by putting the data into the list in the calculator and doing stat, calc, one variable, and then we calculated it and it gave us the 5-number summary. It gives you all of that information. Then we created the box and whisker plots because the minimum will be 1 whisker. It went all the way to 13. This is 15. And then the maximum went all the way to 63. This was 65, so 63 was right before it. And then your quartiles are the lines of the box. Quartile 1 was at 25, quartile 2 was at 34, and quartile 3 was at 47. Okay, so if you were here yesterday, that's where we got all of this. Now today, on the next page, we're going to answer some questions about these. So go ahead and turn to page 9. And I'm going to give you just a few minutes to answer questions 28 through 34. I'm going to leave this projected on the board, that way you don't have to flip back and forth. Okay, so be working on questions 28 through 34 on page 9. The question says, in which decade is the total points scored most consistent? Correct, the 80s. Look, most of the data is right there together in the 80s. That's consistency. Yes, there is a long whisker to the right, but that might be going to one data item. Okay, so the 80s data is definitely most consistent. In which decade is the total points scored most diverse? This one was a little bit harder just to look at and see. So this is what I would recommend. I would recommend calculating the range and the interquartile range for both, or for all of them. Well, we know it's not the 80s, so we won't worry about doing it for it. For the 70s, what is the range? How do you calculate that? Okay, so that would be 63 minus 13, which is 50. What is the interquartile range? How do you calculate that? Okay, and that would give you what, Grant? There's going to be a quiz tomorrow. Shh. Okay, we're not going to worry about doing that for the 80s because we know it's not the most diverse. Now let's do it for the 90s. What is the range for the 90s? Yes, 46, because 73 minus 27. What is the interquartile range? 32. Okay, and then for the 2000s, what is the range? Shh, be quiet. What is it? And the interquartile range? Okay, so this one had the largest interquartile range. And then this largest range, but I would look at interquartile range and say the 90s, because how much data is in the interquartile range? No, how much data is covered just in the interquartile range, just in the box? 50% of the data. So since that one has the largest interquartile range by a good amount, I would go with the 90s being the most diverse. Okay, number 30. In which decade is the largest number of total points scored? The 2000s. Okay, because in the 2000 decade there was 79 points was the highest max, so that's why that's the right answer. In which decade was the third quartile the highest? Right, the third quartile was a 69, which is just a little bit higher than the 2000s third quartile, so 90s. In which decade is the first quartile the highest? The 2000s. Look, it had a quartile 1 of 45, and that's higher than the other quartile ones. And then, in which decade is the outlier the most dramatic? The 80s. See how far this goes compared to the rest of the data? That's the most dramatic. Okay, now let's skip down to number 36. I know, we're just not going to worry about that. Number 36 says, come up with two data sets, so two sets of numbers. They each have to have 5 elements, so 5 numbers. That's why I drew 5 blanks twice. The mean and the median have to both be 9. Okay, so for both of these lists, they have to have a mean of 9 and a median of 9. But they have to be totally different lists so that when you draw their box and whisker plot, the box and whisker plot looks totally different. I'm going to give you a few minutes to work on that on your own. Does everybody understand the directions? You have to create 2 different lists, Kennedy, of 5 numbers. But each list has to average to 9, and each list has to have a median of 9. But the lists have to be so different that when you create a box and whisker plot, they look really different. They have to have an average of 9 and a median of 9. So an average of 9 and a middle number of 9. But they have to be drastically different so that when you create their box and whisker plot, it's drastically different.